podcast today is energy and resources sector lawyer and partner with Hamilton Locke, Matt Baumgurtel. COP26 illuminated the focus of governments, institutions and investors in transitioning to a net zero carbon world. At the heart of the world's plan is a belief that green hydrogen production and fuel can displace a global reliance on emission-intensive fossil fuels. Australia, with its gift of plentiful sun, land and sea, combined with its economic capacity and trade connectivity, sees a chance to become a leader in driving its economy towards being a new export superpower of green hydrogen for Asia and beyond. But is this a realistic ambition? Matt Baumgurtel joins me now. Welcome to Smarter Cities.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you for having me.
It's great to see you. It's a miserable day outside, so a perfect day to be doing a podcast. And welcome in particular to Boardroom.media Studios, who've kindly hosted us here today, and to Will Canty, who runs this amazing enterprise here.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Will. I know you're going to make us look fantastic, so I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
How have you been? All well?
Very well, very busy. The market is pumping. Energy transition, as you've suggested, energy transition, COP26 has lit a fire under a lot of people, and Australia has an enormous opportunity. But even prior to COP26 this year, and I'd actually say the last 2 years have been an enormous growth. There's been enormous growth and appetite for hydrogen investment and hydrogen projects in particular, green hydrogen.
Well, I really want to use this opportunity to get to that actually, because hydrogen has really become the new black, hasn't it? You know, we went through a whole renewable phase and it was all about sun and solar and then wind. And I remember early on in my career when we first met, we were talking about the lack of competitiveness of wind and arguing about whether it would ever be competitive, of course, with fossil fuels. And of course, now it is. And there's been a whole market structure around that to get there. So there's plenty to talk about in that space. But before I get to it, I always like to ask people about how they got into what they got into. So we unfortunately met when we were quite young, at the beginning of our careers. At that time, we thought we were both extremely serious. I think we've learnt that perhaps that might not actually be the case.
Absolutely.
But that's all right. But you've always sort of been fascinated, really, with this space, haven't you?
Yeah.
What is it about it?
So to me, and this is probably an interesting bent for you, is energy is, to me, a corner in a triangle of security and politics. So if you think about modern society, energy, security and politics all feed each other. It's almost the triangle of modern civilization, because without energy we don't have anything. We organise ourselves in a political system, and security sits off the back of that, defence sits off the back of that. So to me, something that fundamental, like everything we do, is driven by energy and energy policy and energy security. So how many wars have been fought about energy security? How many governments have risen and fallen off the back of energy? Energy sits in the middle of everything we do. And as modern society progresses, from the beginning, from the time man learned to create fire and harness fire, we were talking about energy. So it is a building block of civilization.
But why, from a legal perspective, did you choose to get involved? So you're a lawyer. You're a partner in a great firm, Hamilton Locke, which is quite invested in this space. You could have gone banking. You could have gone other ways. Why the law? And I won't make a lawyer joke, I promise. Right?
Well,
I think I just did.
Yeah, I think you did. I think from my perspective, trained as a lawyer, in this space, again, it's that political defence and energy triangle that we talk about. In the law sits in the middle of that, because the law is politics in some respects. The law is certainly defence. Well,
politics creates laws and governs laws, does it not?
Correct, but it floats around it. And I think that, as a lawyer as a lawyer, the reason people are lawyers is not because the law is interesting. Let's be really clear. People are lawyers because they like to solve problems. Complex problems, really complex problems, in a set of frameworks, in a set of laws that you can help clients navigate. You also, as a lawyer, you're there to solve people's problems, right? Fundamentally, a good lawyer has helping their clients at their heart. So to answer your question, why am I a lawyer and why do I do energy? I'm a lawyer because I enjoy the intellectual challenge. Why do I do energy? Because energy is really interesting. It's really interesting, and it changes every day. We were talking about hydrogen 2 years ago. It was a pipe dream. I mean, hydrogen's not new. in any way,
been
shape,
around
or form.
for decades, right?
Well,
Yeah.
200 years, right? It's the building block. You sitting there and I sitting here, we are somewhere between 65% hydrogen. We are hydrogen. It's the H2 of
I
the
didn't actually
H2O,
realise that,
right?
yeah.
I mean, it is the building block. It is the most common element in the universe. It is the building block of everything. Hydrogen is not new. Using hydrogen, creating hydrogen, is relatively new, but it's not that new. Einstein talked about it. Newton talked about it. Right? There are plenty of people out there that have been talking about it for a long time. Creating hydrogen is not new. How we create hydrogen is a little bit new. Electrolysis is a little bit new. Green
But how do
hydrogen.
we scale hydrogen is what we're talking about now, really.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
But
that's the question.
That's
the reason
right.
why I studied economics, for example, right? And why I work in development. Like I like the intellectual challenge of doing big things, big infrastructure
Complicated,
projects,
yep.
big complicated new precincts in cities. It's why I do my day job at Lend-Lease is
Exactly.
about creating really interesting, complex parts of development that you wouldn't traditionally be able to do if you didn't actually think deeply and work with multiple stakeholders and get involved. And the whole political debate about city shaping and energy is a big part of that, right?
Absolutely. So this is why we get along, because we like solving complex problems. We just give a different sort of skill set to it, but ultimately we're just solving complex problems. These are multiple, not three-dimensional, they're 10, 12-dimensional problems, right? And with multiple different stakeholders and different things, different ideas need to be navigated both in terms of now, but on a temporal nature as well across time. So this is the interesting thing when we bring it back to hydrogen. Why now? Okay. Why now for hydrogen is really not driven, in my view, not driven by not driven by carbon, not driven by COP26. These are things that happen in the political space. It's not, you can't drive from a political position. You've got to create a demand. You've got to have a reason for it. And the reason why we need hydrogen, and the reason why green hydrogen is very, very attractive is because we can create it at an infinite rate. All we need is water and electricity. Electricity, the cost of electricity has come down substantially. Like renewable energy is now the cheapest form of energy globally. It is cheaper than coal. It is cheaper than gas. It is also infinite. The sun shines and the wind blows. The problem with both of those things is they're intermittent. The sun only shines in the daytime and the wind only blows when it's windy. That's the problem. So we talk about energy storage and we talk about how to create base load power, or the concept of base load. We need electricity 24/7. We also need a fuel or energy to put in particularly mobile applications, whether that is trains, buses, cars, ships.
Long-haul transportation, shipping, aviation.
Exactly right. So, and that you need a fuel. You need a source of energy that is easily transportable and on demand. So that creates a huge opportunity. So that sector is very difficult to decarbonise. It's very difficult to get away because we've developed internal combustion engines, whether that is petrol or diesel. People often ask me, am I going to drive a hydrogen car? I don't think we're going to drive hydrogen cars. I think we'll drive electric cars. But am I going to get a hydrogen bus to work and get on a hydrogen plane to fly around? Yes, I am. Are our goods going to be shipped internationally using hydrogen or a derivative of hydrogen, ammonia, which is just hydrogen plus?
Yep.
So the answer to that question is yes. And that fundamentally is a replacement of diesel.
Correct.
It's diesel replacement. So just to give that a little bit of a nuance, if you drive a diesel car because you're doing hundreds of thousands of kilometres a year, because that's when diesel becomes economic, then you might drive a fuel cell car, a hydrogen fuel cell car. But if you're doing short hop, even travelling between Melbourne and Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, you can do that in an electric vehicle very easily because the technology is there to recharge those. The refueling or the range risk or the range anxiety that people talk about in electric vehicles is not really there anymore. The fast charging is available to do it. So to answer your question, why hydrogen now? I'd say to you, it's not hydrogen now. But what has created the conditions, the market conditions which mean that hydrogen is viable to decarbonise hard to carbonise industry, and we haven't even talked about steel and all sorts of other stuff.
Yep.
But hard to decarbonise industries is because the cost of electricity, the cost of solar and wind has come down so substantially. Electrolysis gives us a way to fundamentally split water into oxygen and hydrogen. Water, Australia is blessed with having lots of water in terms of seawater. We're an island, and the desalination and then splitting of seawater is where we will end up in a hydrogen space. And we're also blessed with very good wind resources, whether they are onshore or offshore in particular. And we are fundamentally a desert continent. We have lots of space to put big solar farms.
To put the stuff, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that in itself creates a huge opportunity for Australia to lead the world in the export of green hydrogen and green ammonia. Our competitors are Saudi Arabia. Our competitors are the Middle East, because they have, believe it or not, exactly the same. And they are looking at it, we're talking about OPEC countries, they are looking at it as their future.
As a replacement to their current oil dominance, right?
Correct.
That's right.
And it becomes a fuel, right? And the supply chain for green hydrogen is very, very similar to the supply chain for LNG.
Correct. And that's actually, given Australia is one of the pioneers of the LNG sector.
Correct.
That's part of the reason why we're so well placed. But I want to take you back a little bit, because it was a great segment just then. But to your point about it's beside politics that this transition is happening. I'm going to take issue with that, because I actually think that the whole renewable energy sector has been driven by government subsidy up front.
Absolutely.
Right? And so politicians have had to make a decision to do that. And if you think about the trials and tribulations of the Australian scene, the 2007 carbon pollution reduction scheme, which failed ultimately, under John Howard, Kevin Rudd's emissions and trading, I don't even know what it was called, ETS, that failed. Prime Minister Gillard came in, she tried a carbon tax, that failed. It wasn't called a carbon tax, it was called something else, but that's what people know
Can't say tax, yep.
What has been very successful is the renewable energy target, right, which basically has forced investment into renewable energy and subsidized it in a sensible way, because the market actually had some clarity. And I suspect now, if you see the behavior at COP26 of everybody signing up, the signals that global politicians are offering in terms of, yes, we accept now that we're going to have to reduce our emissions. Yes, we accept a net zero target. That's then led to sovereign wealth funds saying, our own administrations are saying a net zero target, so we're going to be investing in net zero things, to use a technical term, right? And that has then led to superannuation funds, semi-government, government also doing the same thing, driving this change. So I agree the market is taking a lead. You only need to see Mark Carney's whole investment thing. I think he's got several $1 trillion now of money that is committed. It committed philosophically, I would say, not committed, in commercial sense. That was all another work stream of COP26. So I think what's really fascinating about this whole debate is we've seen how the emergence of new markets has happened through the renewable energy target, through subsidies or regulation or whatever it might be in different markets. Some have failed, like I think the European emissions trading scheme has not worked. I think that's fair to say. I think ours has been a disaster. Whatever you might think it was the right idea or not, that hasn't worked. But I think the renewable energy target scheme has worked, and I suspect we're going to start to see some form of regulation move around that. And I think politicians have a huge role to play. So I think the interesting thing here is you have one side of politics that's, I'm in 2030, 2050, Harvard, but they haven't necessarily defined how. Another side that is really struggling with it, worried about transitions of industries and whatever, and they've gone all in on hydrogen. And why have they done that? Because of your point that says, well, we've seen this story before in the LNG sector and we understand it. So we can see that we actually, if we go all in on hydrogen, that solves this carbon emissions problem that the world clearly has, right? And not to mention air pollution and whatever that goes with that, which are sort of more immediate impacts. And for once, we actually look at our country and think, well, we've got a strategic advantage. And while Saudi Arabia and the Middle East is focusing on Europe to supply to, we've got Asia on our doorstep.
Absolutely.
And we've already seen a number of agreements with Japan and South Korea and at a governmental level to drive this. So I think your analysis is excellent, in particular on the market response. But I do think global politics has a role.
Absolutely agree. And probably, well, governments have two choices. A choice of two things. Either use a stick or a carrot. Okay? Sticks in taxes don't necessarily work. And we've seen that with carbon taxes and other things around the world. To me, the renewable energy target was also a stick, but it was a very tailored stick. And it was focused on the 100 most emitting energy producers, electricity producers, and the government said, okay, you guys have to buy a certificate to retire because you have a carbon liability, right? It worked. But we've got to remember that its original design was 50,000. Effectively, it was halved. The original target was halved.
Yeah.
Okay, so it created, at the beginning, there was incentive. And the government interfered. The government went and set up ARENA and the CEFC as the government's green bank and the government grant authority, and it funded a huge amount of money. It pumped projects into projects that I delivered.
Effectively, that's a subsidy, though, right?
It is a subsidy.
Yeah.
It's taxpayer money in there. Okay, and then next to that you had the renewable energy target, which created demand for renewable energy because those large electricity producers, retailers, had to. Consumers of electricity, so the Alcoas of the world and the Energy Australias and the Origins, they had to buy these certificates. They could either buy them on market or they could buy them off market from a project, and they would go and sign a power purchase agreement to do that.
Yeah, which is where you've got your explosion of wind energy and solar.
Exactly,
yeah.
But that was the first wave. So those guys haven't signed PPAs for years. For years. All it did, that first trick, so the first government money that went in, from the CEFC and from ARENA, plus the renewable energy target, which was built out. There was sufficient capacity built years ago, but it hasn't stopped the wave of renewables because that first government money pushed the price down. It built an industry and pushed the price down. So we're now delivering projects at much, much lower pricing and well below new build coal, new build nuclear, new build anything. It's the cheapest form of energy. So government subsidy, yes, it got it there, but in terms of a subsidy, we're talking about that subsidy came in about 2011. It was basically gone by 2015, 16 was basically when it had been built out. So no one was buying more energy at that time from then on.
So are you saying at that point that solar or wind or renewables produced at that point were cost competitive or price competitive at that point? At 2015?
I would say that they were cost competitive at 2018.
Okay, so let's take a step back. So let's do it in kilowatt hours, right?
Yep.
So price of coal, price of gas, price of solar, price of wind.
Yep.
Like,
What's cheaper?
What are we kind of trading at?
Well, you can go and get. So let's talk about what the market says that is worth. So the levelised cost of energy for solar is in the low 30s in Queensland. It's well excess of that for coal. Gas is in between. Gas is a little bit more expensive, but coal is much more expensive. So if you're talking about it in terms of what does it cost to build new megawatts today, and that's probably what we need to focus on because you have short-run marginal cost and long-run marginal cost, and I don't want this to be an economic debate,
No,
right?
but it's the key to the power sector, right?
It is. But you've got to overlay on top of that the fact that Australia's coal-fired power stations are some of the oldest in the world. They're well past their design life. They're getting upwards of their useful life.
Didn't they just demolish one of them, Willarrawang?
Yeah, because it's no longer economically viable. These coal-fired power stations relied on them being built essentially on a coal mine, and that coal is running out. And if it's not running out, then it's getting more and more expensive to dig it up.
Yeah.
So, whereas you've got that marginal cost of that coal-fired power station, that every megawatt hour, is going up because the maintenance cost is going up. The reliability is going down because they're old machines. These are machines that were built before we were born.
Design life is about 60 years.
Design life is 30 years.
Oh, 30 years, okay.
And these things are pushing 40 years.
Right, okay. I thought they were longer. Interesting.
The youngest coal-fired power stations are in Queensland, run by CS and Stanwell. They are relatively young coal-fired power stations. They're still within their design life and will be for some time, 15 or 16 years. The planned retirement of coal-fired power stations is, well, effectively there's none left when we start to get out to 2050. There's none left. They're gone, right? We're not building any new ones because it is cheaper to build wind and solar, but that doesn't get you across the intermittency. Right? And that is where it gets interesting.
And that's the key for hydrogen, right? Is it the solution to our base load question?
Hydrogen?
So
no.
2 years ago it was gas.
Right.
Yep.
So
Prime Minister came out, gas is our future.
Right.
Now we're all in on hydrogen.
But this is what's really cool about hydrogen, okay? Because once you've made hydrogen or ammonia and you've got it in a tank, you can do lots with it. It's a gas, right? You can burn it in a turbine. Both GE and Siemens have turbines now, big gas-fired turbines, 650 megawatt turbines, that will burn 100% hydrogen.
Without transition? So
you can buy one now.
So you can transition from gas in a gas turbine today and basically burn hydrogen.
You can buy a turbine now that will burn gas and burn hydrogen 100%.
That's what I understand. Okay.
Right?
So that means that there's low transition cost then between a gas fuel and a hydrogen.
I'm working on projects that are going to get up on financing with LNG.
Yeah, so it goes back to this marginal cost question, right? So that's a big deal.
That's a huge deal.
So you're going from emissions-intensive gas to emissions-free
hydrogen.
Correct. That's what we're saying.
But that's just the energy. That's just electricity, right? So you create the solar. So you create the solar energy. You turn it into hydrogen. You've now got a base load or a fuel source you can burn in a turbine. You can also put it in a bus. You can also put it on a boat and send it to Korea or Japan. Or you can convert it into ammonia and also send it to Japan or Korea. Or turn that ammonia into a fertilizer.
So just are you sending hydrogen in gaseous form or are you sending it in ammonia?
The massive debate.
This is the debate, right?
There's a massive debate.
Sorry, we're jumping around a bit.
No, it's
okay.
good. No,
this is good.
Because this is exactly what I do every day. I was having this conversation with someone just earlier this week. Right, on Sunday actually. So anyway, in my view, so you've got a couple of different. You've got basically three ways to do this. You can compress the hydrogen. You can liquefy the hydrogen, or you can add nitrogen and turn it into ammonia. That's basically your answers. There's different pros and cons for both, right? Compression, obviously it's not liquefaction, so you've got a much bigger tank, right? But it doesn't cost as much of energy, the parasitic energy to compress versus to liquefy. The challenge with liquefied hydrogen, and I am not saying this is not the answer, but you've got to keep it at essentially 0 Kelvin, which is another 100 degrees cooler than LNG. The energy required to do that and to keep it at that temperature is enormous. It's technological advancement will improve that, but it's very, very energy intensive to maintain cryogenic hydrogen. Right? It's also, not only to make it, but to keep it and then to regasify it, you'll also lose a lot of energy on the regasification. So compressed hydrogen actually could potentially be, particularly at a relatively short haul. So I'm working on projects which are make the hydrogen in Queensland, send it to Victoria. That's a compressed type of...
So that's a domestic supply,
That's a domestic game,
And in the
right?
short term, that will be via truck, one imagines.
You would do it via truck, but again, if you can put it on a vessel, you're going to be you're going to create
coastal shipping.
Coastal shipping, right? And then you can talk about whether the hydrogen's in a pipe or not. We can talk about gas networks and come back to that. But there's a lot of work going into that right now.
And again, to convert existing gas pipelines to be capable of hydrogen
Well, you
supply.
can put hydrogen in the gas pipeline.
In fact, there was a test recently, right? 10% hydrogen through a gas pipeline.
Correct.
I think it was Gemini that did it, if I'm not mistaken.
They're doing it in Germany, they're doing it in Japan.
Yeah.
The Tokyo Olympics were a hydrogen Olympics.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So you can do it. So the challenge and I'm definitely not the technical person, but the challenge with natural gas pipelines is a lot of them are very old.
Yeah.
Natural gas molecule is the size of a beach ball. A hydrogen molecule is the size of a golf ball. So if your pipe is old and it has micro cracks in it, you'll leak hydrogen. Leaking hydrogen is not a good answer. right? Particularly if it's leaking hydrogen in an open space is irrelevant, right? Because you'll never ignite it because there's not enough of it condensed.
But if it's going through an urban area, that would never be allowed, right? I mean,
look, it's as dangerous as LNG. It's as dangerous. I mean, there's no real difference here, right? But what's relevant for the purposes of hydrogen, I think, is that we can use our existing gas infrastructure, particularly the new infrastructure. But really what we're talking about is putting hydrogen into pipelines that exist, that are relatively young in the Surat and the Bowen basins, for example, that are now currently taking coal seam gas, natural gas, out of the ground and shipping it to Gladstone. There is no reason why you could not put a significant amount of hydrogen in that network and take the hydrogen out at the end, take the LNG or take natural gas off, the hydrogen off, compress the hydrogen or turn it into ammonia or do something else with it, take the LNG off, you can access that network that exists now. So that creates, and we're talking about hydrogen and domestic supply and international supply, export markets, that's where it gets really interesting for Australia because that market's enormous, both in terms of hydrogen being compressed or potentially liquefied. Where I think it lands, and this is where you started with the question, where I think it lands as ammonia.
That's what I'm hearing too. That's why I'm asking the question.
And
is it it's just like liquefied, gas, right? It's not like we don't
ammonia.
transfer. Yeah.
Well,
No,
ammonia.
so we transfer
Yeah.
gas in liquid form now. Why wouldn't we do it with hydrogen?
Well, ammonia is even better because ammonia is basically liquid at room temperature,
Okay, so it's easier to transport.
right?
Yeah.
And
In fact, I think we're transporting it now. I've heard, yeah.
the global trade in ammonia is enormous. You need it to make fertilizers. You make most of the world's fertilizers are made from ammonia. The world eats ammonia. Without ammonia, there'd be no fertilizers to grow the crops that we eat. That's the biggest market for ammonia right now. The explosives market is also very big. Right? So most of the ammonia that's being made, there's an enormous ammonia trade, global trade in ammonia. Most of it's made from hydrocarbons, which are terribly CO2 emissive. Right? There's a big problem. But most of it's for fertilizers and explosives. It's a relatively small market when we compare it to coal. But let's do that comparison. So Australia exports a huge amount of coal to places like Japan. Let's just talk about Japan and South Korea.
Both great countries.
Both great countries. Both of them have relatively young, actually quite young, very efficient coal-fired power stations. And we sell them our very high-quality coal to put in their very high-quality coal-fired power stations. They are experimenting burning ammonia in those coal-fired power stations, co-burning. So the global, our export market of coal to Japan is enormous. Japanese are already talking about putting up to 20% ammonia in, co-firing. So 20% of Australia's coal could be replaced with ammonia. That's 20 times the global trade in ammonia.
Wow.
By volume. Wow. It's enormous. The opportunity is enormous. And that's just existing built coal-fired power stations that can take it. Unfortunately, our coal-fired power stations are not good enough. They're not young enough. They're not, high-intensity, low-emission coal-fired power stations. They don't burn at the rate that's required. They can't take the heat. So ammonia burns very hot, right? And it is not it's not an unsafe substance, but it's not a safe substance.
Well, it goes into explosives. It must be pretty good at something, right?
Correct, and the tragedy in Beirut will tell you.
Yes, exactly.
Right,
I was thinking that. Yeah.
Right, that you've got to be careful with this stuff.
Yeah.
But it's no more dangerous than petrol. It's no more dangerous than right. So you think about it in that context. So that's a real opportunity for Australia. So you asked me what I think it was going to be. What I think it will be. I think it's ammonia. I think that the big players in hydrogen globally, Intercontinental Energy, CWP, just to name two large businesses that are operating in Australia, they will tell you that it's ammonia, right? And because of the ease of it. Now, the ammonia piece requires more energy to make. So you make hydrogen, so you create energy, wind and solar. You convert it to hydrogen, and now you've got to convert it to ammonia, which requires more energy. Or you lose electricity.
But as long as you're doing it with renewables,
which are very cheap.
Which are cheap.
If not, may have a marginal cost of zero.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. So that's the game changer here, right? Is the price of renewables that again, was kickstarted by a
Government
subsidy scheme and
Exactly.
CFC, blah blah, right?
Exactly. So then we go, well, what do we need? So government subsidies and taxation's a dirty word, but government subsidy, government tax,
Incentive, structure, regulation,
carrots and
whatever it
sticks,
might be.
everything else, they work.
Yeah.
And they work in relatively short period of time. We've got that in renewable energy, right? The renewable energy target tells you that it does. So what should government be doing now? Government should be doing exactly the same. And they need to, on the hydrogen side. And you need to attack it from both angles. And most of the hydrogen support that is being provided across states and territories in Australia, let's leave the feds to the side for the moment, most of it is actually focused on the supply side.
Production,
making
right?
it, right?
Yeah.
Because the problem has been, okay, hydrogen needs to be cost competitive with fossil fuel, or for the hydrocarbons, it needs to be, the holy grail is $2 a kilo.
Yeah,
okay?
we've been hearing this $2.
$2 a kilo, right? So everyone's focused on, how do we make hydrogen for $2 a kilo? I'll tell you how to make hydrogen for $2 a kilo. Create a demand for hydrogen.
Yes. So,
right?
and one of the hydrogen producers said this to me recently.
Right.
The best way to get cost competitive in production is to create
Demand.
Right?
Yeah. So, and that's what New South Wales government's got right in its hydrogen strategy, because it's focused on both.
So tell me about the demand side of this. So I get the special activation precincts, I get the hydrogen hubs. The other states are also doing this, Victoria, how are they doing it on the demand side?
So, ways to stimulate demand. Well, any heavy haulage or large vehicle that is currently run on diesel can be run on ammonia or hydrogen. Let's just call it hydrogen to begin with, okay? So the transition of bus fleets, garbage trucks, trains, anything like that, in my view, should be focused on hydrogen.
And they've said that they're going to transition all that stuff to hydrogen.
There's already plans to do so, right? They are, but if you're asking me what they should do, that's what they should do. There are plans to do that. They're very much focused on the demand side to do that.
So I'm going to interrupt. Sorry. So let's just have the debate now, because I think it's a good point, between hydrogen fuel cell and battery. So we talked earlier about cars, right? Yep. I mean, it's interesting your perspective on cars. I agree. I think cars will be EVs, but depends on what energy they're being charged on. If they're currently they're being charged on coal-fired, a lot of coal-fired power.
Absolutely.
That will become hydrogen or gas in the interim, maybe hydrogen in the future, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, a world where you park your car in your garage at home
and you plug it in,
and that now becomes a battery within your system. You've got rooftop solar, and Australia has the largest penetration of rooftop solar.
Again, subsidised. Again,
heavily subsidised with problems.
Yep.
Creates a lot of problems in the market. And again, don't want to make this an energy market debate, but rooftop solar creates a huge amount of problems in the market because it distorts. It doesn't follow market wholesale
Not to
pricing.
mention that everyone starts abandoning the transmission network, but we'll come back to that issue, right? Let's go back to the battery question.
Yeah. So the battery versus hydrogen. So the best analogy I can think of, and I think analogies are really helpful in my mind to explain. A battery, whether it be grid scale or in a car, is like a Ferrari. Okay, it's very fast to respond, but it doesn't have a big fuel tank, and it's not going to tow a trailer. It's not going to tow a caravan, right? Hydrogen in a hydrogen fuel cell is like diesel. It has grunt. The energy intensity is enormous. You can go long distance, and if you've got sufficient volume of sufficient distance to cover, then it'll be a fuel cell. Vehicles that are running 24/7 or running 12 hours a day, delivery trucks, interstate trucking, trains, buses, garbage trucks, all of these things are doing long kilometres every day. Okay, you don't need a battery to do that. You need grunt. You need torque.
So I learned earlier today that there's a 5 times storage for hydrogen versus battery. It charges in 5 minutes versus 45 minutes for a battery. So a hydrogen fuel cell, even though the technology is still evolving, already beats a battery, which is perhaps why Elon Musk is so angry with this whole emergence of hydrogen, where I think he was quoted as saying it's the most foolish idea ever, right?
It's one of the most self-serving statements I've
Yes.
seen.
Well, it's entirely a self-serving statement, but that's okay.
But I think we're going to drive Teslas.
Yeah, I think we are too,
Right?
because they'll be charged by hydrogen.
Well,
That's kind of my view on this, and I could be wrong.
I think they'll be grid charged, right?
But where's the energy coming from through
Wind
the
and
grid?
solar.
Wind and solar and baseload power.
But they
will
won't
be.
charge when it's not windy and it's not
That
sunny.
is true. No, that's a good point.
Right?
Yeah.
So you and I don't drive our cars every day. Or if we do, we're driving it for 20 minutes or an hour.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
We're not professional drivers.
Yeah.
So our cars can go from our home to our office or to our home to the shopping centre, wherever we're going, we plug them in. The Internet of Things allows us to potentially go from, use that store of energy as an arbitrage. We can buy and sell the energy that's stored in that vehicle depending on the market price. It becomes, this integrated network becomes very, very powerful in a battery context. I do not think we'll be driving hydrogen vehicles. I agree.
I don't think we'll be driving hydrogen
But I
vehicles.
do think that our Woolworths delivery will come in a hydrogen truck. We'll get a hydrogen bus to work, and we potentially will get on a hydrogen plane to go to Melbourne or Brisbane.
So you're saying, I agree with this analysis, that long haul transport, whether it's long haul as in 400 kilometres from A to B, will be hydrogen fuel cell driven in some way,
Yep.
and long haul urban vehicles, whether they be your Woolworths delivery truck that seems to be arriving at our house constantly, as my children seem to be eating more and more.
More and more.
Right?
I know that.
And other delivery trucks like the Amazon delivery truck that also seems to be a regular occurrence as more and more cardboard boxes seem to arrive. Of what? Who knows? But that's okay.
Ours is not to ask why.
They will be, exactly right. They will likely be also some form of hydrogen fuel cell, but your domestic vehicle will be likely a Tesla battery or some kind of battery, not to preference Tesla over the Nissan Leaf or whatever else, right?
Correct.
And then to overlay a little bit more on this is a debate I had with a bunch of the development graduates recently around, will car ownership even be a thing?
Yeah,
Right,
absolutely.
and sort of from a funds perspective, I'd love to own a fleet of vehicles that operate 24/7, and that basically it's an institutional ownership of it, and the cars are rented, much like apartments are now rented through build to rent in many countries, right?
Yep.
Why wouldn't it be the same with cars?
Absolutely.
Why wouldn't you want full utilization of a vehicle 24/7?
Particularly if you're running it as and that's a vehicle that you run on hydrogen. That's a fuel cell vehicle.
well, exactly. Right?
That's vehicle on demand. That's transport on demand. And then you're talking about robotics. You're talking about lots of different things,
Lots of
right?
things.
Automation of vehicles.
And then it gets further than that, which is say, well, if in urban living, and this is a podcast about urban life, do you need car parks anymore? If you don't have significant car ownership, you live in the city in an apartment, do you need car parks? What happens to a basement car park? The cost of infrastructure to support a large residential building, the basement is significant.
Absolutely.
But perhaps you do need basement. What else happens with a basement? Is it storage? Do people need to store stuff? There's a whole, probably another podcast.
There's a waste piece there
all
to
of
talk
this.
about.
Then there's a waste piece. Now, okay, so let's get to waste, right? But sorry, I'm going to take a step back. Before we get
That's
to
a
waste,
podcast
I want to
in
get
itself, by the
well, it is, but waste is important. I want to get back to long haul transport, right? So, Australia, land of distance, land of desert. We have lots of stories about life on the road here, as I've learned since coming here. It's sort of almost a rite of passage, really, to drive long distances. Even people who live in cities, sort of, one of the big, I read a survey about the biggest concerns about batteries was running out of distance, about battery on distance. Well, not many
Distance
people
anxiety.
are driving these days those sorts of distances, but point aside. Australia's emissions have gone substantially down over the time since we went on this journey, except
Transport.
in the transport sector.
Absolutely.
In fact, if I'm correct,
Hard
and
to
you'll correct
decarbonise.
me, we're up some 20% or something on long haul transport. What is
Because of
the
Amazon,
future?
by the way.
Because of probably right. Sorry, Amazon. We're kidding.
Yeah, no.
What is the future of long haul transport? How do we move from diesel fuel trucks and the infrastructure that goes with that to something else?
So the answer, it's a leading question, and thank you for it. The answer is hydrogen, right?
Yeah.
The answer is that you can refuel a truck with diesel and with hydrogen at the same pace, right? It's the same refueling.
That's the point I was making earlier. It's the same. That's the problem with batteries for long haul trucks. They take time and they're heavy. Right?
Look, they're heavy, but technology is improving that.
Yeah,
right?
no doubt.
But electric trucks will exist, and Elon Musk and lots of others are pushing that very, very hard. If you ask me to pick how does it play, I think hydrogen becomes more effective, more efficient. You also, what you've got to overlay in a long haul transport context is that every driver of a truck has to brake every so many hours for at least half an hour.
Exactly. So that's not going to change, right? Until we get autonomous long haul trucks, and unless we're in the Transformers tomorrow, and I haven't seen the film, but I've seen the containers kind of rushing down the highway. Yeah. We're a long way away from that.
We are autonomous. Yes, I think we're most likely inland rail is probably more going to be the answer before it becomes.
I agree.
So autonomous vehicles. Again, if you make something autonomous, then you're not paying for a person to sit there. So does it really matter whether that truck's going to run 24/7? If it needs to charge up, spend 2 hours of that 24 charging, or even 3 or 4 or 5 hours of that charging, it's still on the road for 20 hours. So you don't. So that I don't think is going to be the impetus. What I think is going to be the impetus is that hydrogen gives you the grunt. Right?
More so than a battery at current technology levels.
Correct.
Right?
Correct. It gives you the grunt.
Yeah.
And they are interchangeable. I don't think the competition of this is, to me, it's wrong to say they're a competition, because it's going to be electric vehicles that you and I are going to drive, and potentially driving around the cities. They may be, autonomous or not. And there are going to be hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, which are going to do the heavy lifting. They're the Mack truck of energy. Hydrogen and energy storage generally is a Mack truck. So another analogy, lithium batteries, the big ones that we've got on the grid, like at Hornsdale and others, right? They are fast response batteries. They can respond faster than most of the network can actually realise, in hundredths of a second. Okay, they are Ferraris, right? Their ability to provide frequency and voltage in the grid is that. But they're very short, sharp, right? They're a race car. Compare that to something like pumped hydro or hydrogen being burnt in a turbine, or a redox flow battery. They are big energy shifting batteries. They're big Mack trucks of energy. The same analogy can be made for transport, and transport is, as you said, one of the hardest to decarbonise, because you need that energy intensity in the fuel, and you get that from hydrogen. At the moment, battery technology is a much larger, heavier way to create or to store that energy. Hydrogen fuel cells and technology for those fuel cells is improving literally every day. I act for a couple of different businesses with a couple of different technologies, and some of the efficiency gains that they're saying just by slightly tweaking things in a fuel cell is enormous. So there's a long way to go. And I was sort of thinking about this, and in a context of, to give it an automotive feel, we talk about Henry Ford, right, and Model T Ford, which is the first real production. Okay, we've arguably in electric vehicles we haven't had our our T model yet. Right? We haven't had our first commercial scale. We've got Tesla, but it's really not out there running around the way that.
No, it's still a luxury vehicle, right? It's still not accessible to everyone.
Exactly. Yeah. But that's coming. Right? It's coming with Nissan, it's coming with Toyota, it's coming with volume there, but that's going to be electric. We are way back at steam engine type cars when we talk about hydrogen and hydrogen fuel cells. Right? We're way back at the beginning.
So the trucks, I think, are very early stage. Hyundai already has some that are in trial, I think, in Switzerland. There's another company, Hyzon, that's producing heavy vehicles. Correct. There's a huge debate, I think, between Volvo, Scania, and these other companies around whether battery trucks are the place. So I almost feel...
And you've forgotten our Australian homegrown H2X.
Of course, sorry, yes. And of course, love the Australian brand too, which I know a little less about, actually, but it's great that we're doing it. Where I was going with this is I almost do feel that this is a bit of a battle between the famous VHS versus Beta debate. Back when the history of that, of course, was well before us, but that was a fascinating history. Arguably, Beta was supposedly the better technology, yet VHS captured the market, and I just wonder whether we're in that space now.
I don't think we're going to have. To me, there's not going to be a dominant It's because
it's going to be a mix.
It has to be a
argument.
mix.
Yeah.
It has to be a mix. Because you and I are going to drive electric vehicles, electric cars, right? Consumer cars. Okay. Our goods are going to be shipped in hydrogen vehicles, hydrogen long-haul transport, right? Planes, trains, buses, stuff, right? Trucks, all that sort of stuff. Is going to be delivered in a hydrogen context, not a hydrogen fuel cell context. We're going to, at a grid scale, an electricity grid scale, we're going to have fast response lithium batteries to give us the physics of electricity, the frequency and the voltage control that's required to make sure that power comes out of the power point properly, right? Equally, we're going to have other forms of energy storage, whether it be pumped hydro, whether it be flow batteries, particularly, just to name a couple, that provide different solutions for energy storage. To take energy when it's made, wind and solar, and remove its intermittency, make it available on demand. Okay, and there's a cost of doing that, which is the efficiency. How much, if you put 100 electrons in, how many do you get out? At scale, pumped hydro wins hands down. Right? At scale, absolutely. Gravitational energy.
Which is partially why the investment in Snowy Hydro 2 was made, I suspect.
Absolutely, but if you think about, Snowy is 2 gigawatts. Snowy pumped hydro is 2 gigawatts. We probably need 8 gigawatts of pumped hydro storage in New South Wales to replace the coal.
Which means we need to be building more of it, substantially more of it. Yeah.
And there are lots of options to do that. That is a transition. If you're talking about what's the end point of a transition, the end point of a transition is lots of wind, lots of solar, because it's cheap. It's the cheapest form of energy. And then you've got to get rid of the intermittency, so you've got to store it. Storing it at a large scale is pumped hydro. Storing it at a smaller scale is flow batteries. And storing it to create or to manage grid conditions, what electricity people like me call FCAS, the FCAS market, frequency voltage control market, which we need because you need to control the way that the electricity flows around the network. You do that with a lithium battery. So there's a mix. This is not a VHS versus beta moment. But to give you to use another video analogy, because you've reminded me of it, there's a real debate going on right now as to whether service stations are having their blockbuster moment.
Well, yes, right. Good. That's my point earlier about what is the supply chain, what is the infrastructure that will transition to something.
Correct. So you and I charge our cars in our garages or in the street, and they're doing it in London,
Do you remember that company Better Place? So about 10, 15 years ago, they entered the market with a whole plan to basically start EV charging stations all over the city. Of course, they were way too early and died, right?
Yep.
But the concept was, well, actually, we're going to start putting out EV charging stations, and also it was based on the idea of actually changing the battery, right? So of course that's not going to happen. But the concept was kind of right. What happens in this case?
So on the electric side, I think that if you're lucky enough to have a garage in Sydney, then you'll charge.
You charge at home, right?
You charge at home.
Yeah.
And you may sign up with your electricity retailer to let them control the battery, charge and discharge it, right? And that's now we start talking about virtual power plants, which is a whole new piece, and the whole regulatory environment around that is about to change. So that gets really interesting. In my view, you and I will drive those electric vehicles. We'll either plug it into our garage, or we'll plug it into a lamppost like they do in London.
Yeah, you plug it into a street.
Into a lamppost,
anywhere, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
If you park on the street, that will be the answer. Overlay that with less and less car ownership, because people, if they will hire a car if they want to drive to Brisbane, and otherwise they'll get an Uber, or whatever
it is,
ride-sharing app, ride-sharing thing. Hydrogen for heavy haulage or long transport. At the moment, those trucks and trains don't refuel at your local petrol station. They refuel at their depot. They're not buying diesel from the local BP.
No, that's right. They're specialist facilities.
Right. So you'll do the same with hydrogen. It'll just be a facility where you plug, you fill it up. They're not, So the service station becomes a lot more about service and a lot less about station.
Well, it's already really.
It's already a convenience store.
It's already a convenience store where you happen to get fuel.
Where you can buy petrol.
Yeah.
So those become convenience stores. So there's an interesting question as to whether service stations are having their blockbuster moment.
Well, arguably, people might say that the supermarket is having its blockbuster
It
moment.
is.
The department
Absolutely.
store
Yes,
is having
absolutely.
its blockbuster moment as we move to a distributed model where things get delivered to you on a far more regular occurrence.
In
than
hydrogen trucks.
in hydrogen trucks, right? So it's an interesting, when you put it that way, you sort of start to see that actually it's all related to the whole
Absolutely.
shift. And in fact, the pandemic, if anything, has accelerated the shift,
Supercharged
right?
it, yeah.
So there's definitely been a supercharge in supermarket supermarket distribution, for example, changed
Absolutely.
completely as a consequence of the pandemic. Same
It was
with,
changing.
It was changing already, but it was
Forced.
turbocharged.
It was
Yeah,
forced.
you can't go out, right?
Correct.
Yeah, same with online shopping for clothes and shoes and whatever. I think
Absolutely.
there was probably a bit of a hurdle around people saying, I still like to go and have a look at something. And
The shopping experience.
Yep.
But you're going to have, I think you still will have some bricks and mortar retail.
Yes,
But it
yeah.
will be an exclusive experience. It will not be, I need a new pair of jeans.
Yeah, so we had this debate where I had a retail expert come on the show, and Gary Horwitz, who's an amazing guy, and it's exactly what he said. He said retail is not about shopping, it's about experience. It's about having a great burger or being able to go somewhere with your friends, or and in Asia, I'm an Asian kid, I'm from Asia. Shopping centres are a place of entertainment.
Yes.
That's where you go. It's not the case in Australia. Like, you don't go to a shopping centre necessarily for dinner, right? In Asia, you do, right? So there's a whole
the
nother
quality of the
podcast
product.
again in this debate, in this discussion. But I want to just take us back to hydrogen and the energy market, because we've touched on a lot of really interesting parts. And the bit that I'm really interested in is, what do we do now? So we touched on the New South Wales government hydrogen strategy. There's one in Victoria, there's one in Queensland. The Fortescue Future Industries, Andrew Forrest, one of our great entrepreneurs with FMG, is now going all in.
Own the space, yep.
Yep, he's gone big on starting new electrolyzer manufacturing facilities, which is really interesting, because he wants to be able to
Make it
make it here, and he wants to be able to generate as much of the stuff as possible. He's going big,
Absolutely.
trying to generate demand. Great. So we go back to the beginning, right? We had the beginnings of the regulatory environment, the RET,
I thought you were going
did
to
a
say
lot
the
of
Big
work.
Bang, right? Because
the
that's
Big
the beginning
Bang.
of hydrogen.
Well, yeah, we might not go that far
sorry.
back. Might not go that far back. What is today's regulatory market meant to do to turbocharge Australia to the top? So if we are going to be this export superpower, as our politicians are telling us we're going to be, and this perhaps is the green revolution that everyone keeps talking about, and the markets are going all in, right, to an extent. There's small pilot investments at the moment that are going in, increasingly larger, but the big bulk of the investment will be from the state, from the public sector at the beginning. What does that look like?
So I think the answer to that question is realising the potential. I think most state governments have realised that
And the
potential.
federal government
And the
has,
fed- and the feds.
and the opposition, everyone, all
Everyone
politicians,
is on board, right?
Green hydrogen, new black.
The
What do they do?
new black. So what do they do? So one of the first things that the global community needs to get certification right. So the big debate, and this is probably a little bit boring, but how do you know your hydrogen's green?
Well, exactly, right? Because we haven't gone into that, but there's 5 different colours of hydrogen.
No, there's a rainbow.
And there's a rainbow of it, and really people only care about blue and green. The other ones are
Grey, purple,
grey,
pink,
purple,
orange,
whatever,
right?
right?
Clear. There are lots of different.
But just to be clear, everybody wants green, as in hydrogen produced with renewable energy,
Correct.
not produced by carbon capture or storage or gas or whatever else.
Exactly right.
We're talking about green hydrogen.
What's
That's the utopia.
It is. Well,
Right.
it's the reality, because we can do it. The way that you do it is you do it a couple of different ways. You got to get the certification right. So if I'm in Japan and I'm buying hydrogen from Australia, I want to be able to say to my constituents that I'm buying green hydrogen. We haven't even talked about ESG, right? But the reason I'm buying that is because, for lots of reasons, I need to meet ESG goals, or my consumers require me to do it. That will be the impetus for them to buy green over blue or grey or black or whatever we're going to call it, whatever colours we got. But how do I know? Right? You're now talking about, because in an Australian context, or in a national context, you certify it. Okay, so you have a certification. We have the Clean Energy Regulator in Australia, which regulates clean energy. Right, it gives a certificate if you make clean energy.
Yep. Just like we have certification of food or certification of tablets or whatever it is, right?
Right. So this is where come back to where we started. This is where the politics meets energy, because international politics requires there to be a a system of trust to say that the Australian certification of that hydrogen is correct. Right? Now, that Japanese buyer of green hydrogen, they can buy Australian with an Australian certificate, or they can buy Korean with a Korean certificate. Are they equal? Do we have the same confidence? Do we, compared to another, Vietnam have made green hydrogen, or someone else, America's made green hydrogen.
Telecom, we have the International Telecommunications Union, right? They try and set these sorts of standards for 5G or whatever else, right? You can tell I've been playing with this stuff for a little while. What's the equivalent in the energy sector?
Doesn't exist.
Doesn't exist.
So you ask what the challenges are? There's a challenge for an export market.
Sounds like a new institution you lawyers can build.
Well, it shouldn't be built by the lawyers, to be honest.
I agree, by the way.
But the problem is it gets bogged down in international relations, right?
Yeah.
But that's a challenge. Okay. So what you're going to have, and the way that the world is setting up itself, is bilaterals. Right? So these agreements between Germany and Australia, and between Australia and Japan, and Australia and Korea, the premise of those, or the value that will come out of those, is the certification.
So that's really interesting, right? So you're saying groupings, like the Quad, for example, right? Or
you asked me to predict things. I'm predicting that's the way it goes, right?
This is greenfield stuff here, right?
Yep.
No one's done this before, really.
No.
They have. We're trying to relate it to the emergence of the renewable sector.
Yep.
But this is somehow bigger in a way because it has this export capacity element to it, right? Which I never really bought before until with wind and solar, like I am buying with this, right?
We can't.
Yeah. Well, there was a whole. There was a whole idea that if we got the technology right on wind and solar, we could then wind and solarify, if that's a word, everyone else. That has happened to some extent, right? Lots of businesses going out and advising other countries. But this is different. This is actually the export of the energy itself.
Well, that's exactly right.
That's the difference here. And that's the LNG thing, right?
Yeah. Well, hydrogen gives you the ability. So this is what gets me really excited about hydrogen. I was going to sort of end our discussion on this point, but let me throw it in there right now. Hydrogen, green hydrogen, allows Australia to export its sun and its wind. We can export the weather.
I was talking to someone from Britain earlier today who said that every time there was sun, people stop working and go out and enjoy the sun. We don't have that problem.
Well, but the English...
Apart from today, it seems.
Well, the English are going really hard into green hydrogen through offshore wind.
Yes.
Well, lots of wind.
They've got plenty of wind.
Plenty of wind, so they're taking advantage of that. How England, the UK, can win in green hydrogen and we lose is beyond me. Really, it's beyond me.
We have better assets.
We have much better natural resources. We are blessed with our wind and our solar resources. We should win this. We can export the sun and the wind in the form of green hydrogen, and Australia can win that whole. The world is up for grabs, and we should win. We have got all the reasons to win, and in some respects, we just need the politicians to sort of do a little few things and then get out of the way.
Right. So we got off that. So certification. What else?
Demand. So what will happen first?
Creation of demand.
Creation of demand in Australia. So domestic demand.
Yeah.
So if government wants to do something today, you can say, I'm going to go and buy hydrogen buses, hydrogen garbage trucks, my government fleet, not necessarily the small car fleet for Commonwealth
so
car
you've
stuff.
just touched local government, you've touched state government.
And potentially the feds, right? But vehicles that are doing, you got to sort of sit there and go, okay, vehicles that do over 150,000 kilometres a year
should be
hydrogen.
Yeah.
If the government did that today, it would create sufficient demand, or a lot more demand for green hydrogen.
Well, that's a form of renewable energy target, effectively.
Correct.
Because that's what the renewable energy target is. It's demand target.
Exactly. So, but it's also a subsidy because those vehicles are more expensive than buying a petrol one, which is a different discussion, right? But so the government is spending more than it could otherwise, but it does that on a policy decision to create demand, and the externality of it is it's got a vehicle, which it's going to need anyway.
It's a market starting investment, right?
Correct.
That's sort of the argument here, right?
Correct.
And it's not the first time we've subsidised industries. We can only go into the car industry, for example, which at one point was, I can't remember the number, did 2,000 cars per year or something.
Yeah, an enormous amount.
For a substantial subsidy.
The single largest subsidy provided by the federal government in Australia today is a diesel subsidy.
Yeah, correct, for farm equipment and industry and whatever else.
The most heavily subsidised industry in Australia, taking your tax dollars and mine, is into fossil fuels, is into diesel.
Which clearly is going to change by the sounds of things.
Well, just equally subsidise it. So don't stop the diesel subsidy, but give an equal subsidy to hydrogen, and then you'll see an equal. That's an equal playing field. That's an equal playing field.
So certification, regulation, and equalisation, I suppose, is what you'd call it, between fossil fuel and energy and hydrogen, just like we saw effectively for wind and solar. What I'm trying to do is show that we've done this before.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is not a new thing.
This is not a new thing.
We know how to do this, and in order for Australia to be successful, we've now got the political sponsorship is there. What I think is really interesting is it's a political sponsorship that is global and competitive. So the Europeans have now put €500 billion, apparently, in the next 10 years into hydrogen infrastructure development, right? Like, given most of the countries have no money at all, where it comes from, another question. But, they're doing it.
Germany have put billions of euros into it.
Well, billions, right? So $500 billion in 10 years, that's a big amount of money. Then you've got all the, as we talked about earlier, the sovereign wealth funds, the superannuation, there's plenty of money, right? It's just a question of creating that demand and, as you quite correctly say, confirming that it's green and not some other rainbow colour.
Absolutely.
Right?
So that transition, so what does the Australian government do? It creates domestic demand for green hydrogen, and then it creates a certification system to do that. Then you start to get hydrogen to go from $8 a kilo to $6 to $3, and then you're at magic 2, or you're at least within touching distance of 2, and then you can go and sign contracts with Japan, Korea, and everybody else at $2 and make it.
Yeah, and then it'll fall even further as the demand goes further, right? So, look, I mean, it's an exciting future. Look, you won't believe this, but we'll have to end soon. And it's been an absolutely fascinating and robust discussion, as always. But I usually like to end these things by asking my guests for 3 things that they would like to see for Australia to really achieve, right? So I tend to spend my podcast talking about what we can do as a country, how we can actually punch above our weight as a country, because I love this country and I'm passionate about it. I know you are. You're big on this. We've talked about some of the things, but if you were to sum it up in 3 brief things, what would they be?
I think the opportunity for Australia to dominate the world in hydrogen, in green hydrogen, is there, and we need government to support that the same way that it's supported, successfully supported solar and wind with the renewable energy targets. I think one is that, and we've talked about all the ways that government can do that. I think that government can also support the R&D piece, and the R&D piece is the Australian support of R&D and new technologies is not great.
No, in fact, we didn't even touch on that, did we?
Yeah, we didn't. So, but
it's a big deal.
But people who are looking to raise funds find it very difficult to raise funds in Australia because it's inherently conservative, and they go to America.
Yeah, okay. That's true. And many technology sectors, and a whole nother podcast on that too.
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's avoid that for hydrogen, green hydrogen. That would be my suggestion, because we do have the smart people here to do it. Let's stop exporting our ideas and start exporting commodities. So I think that would be first. That would be the second, and then I think the opportunity for transition. So we need to really, the phrase is a just and fair transition. So we've got large coal communities that are built around fossil fuels.
Yes.
Okay, we need to not leave them behind.
This is such an important point.
Very important. So we need policies around that, and all of those people in those communities, they want a future, right? And holding on to the past is not a future. We need to help them transition, and that to me is, we see that in renewable energy zones and other things, other government policies, but they can be part of the energy transition. They should be actually in the middle of it. So what do we need? What should we do? We should help those communities transition, and that's not just putting everyone into a TAFE course. It is supporting local industry to build electrolyzers, supporting local demand for green hydrogen, to create a domestic market which will lead to an export market. Take a longer view. Just because we're buying green hydrogen today for $8 a kilo doesn't mean that in 3 or 5 or 10 years' time it won't be $2, because it will be $2, right? It's not going to be $8 forever. So to me, take a view around that transition, get everyone on board behind, every community behind it, and that will, the politics then looks after itself.
Articulate as always. Matt Baumgurtel, thank you so much for being part of Smarter Cities.
Thank you very much.